Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, how you doing, everybody? Today we're doing the regular summer Friday thing of pretending that it is, this particular time we're pretending it is Friday, June 23rd, 2017. Of course, for me, it is not, but I am preparing ahead of time for that eventuality, as it is a travel day, as we pick up the younger son from Scout Camp later today. Very exciting development. No doubt, Friday, I'm going to take a stab at it. I'll say probably being consumed with the further digestion of the discussion draft of the Senate Republicans' version of their tax cut bill masquerading as a health care bill. By now, most of the major elements will have been uncovered and will have been dissected and digested, but I'm sure there's continuing commentary on that today. We'll have to just roll along with our regularly scheduled examination of the shadiness of Donald Trump. There's always room for that, and there's plenty to catch up on that front. Lots of things that we have set aside and ignored for the time being so that we could catch up with other current events, but Friday offers us the chance to get conversant in it prior to the big weekend break. Anybody got any big plans for the weekend? We'll be having a good time with the kids and visiting cousins and relatives this weekend, and no doubt discussing the impending disaster, both in healthcare and in the corruption of our president by foreign operators. Okay, lots to catch up on, as I mentioned, on that front. We began, or rather, I guess, ended what will be yesterday's show, taking a quick look at how some of the various shady activities of the Trump campaign might end up fitting neatly under campaign finance law, existing campaign finance law, rather than being espionage investigations necessarily, but also hinted at the possibility of there being investigations into financial crimes by the Mueller probe and others. And so we were not certain whether it was going to end up being campaign financial crimes, but it's certainly a possibility. But there's so much more out there in terms of just straight up money laundering that may or may not have anything at all to do with the campaign. A piece that Greg shared with me in his list, his raft of stories during the Thursday show that did not get read. In fact, two pieces sort of related to the entire Trump-Russia story that that we didn't get to discuss yesterday. The first one on the financial side, and very familiar, but a new piece that would have been, dateline from Wednesday, the 21st in Bloomberg. Timothy O'Brien with this piece, Trump, Russia, and a shadowy business partnership. It's almost as if, I don't know, I'm glad his stuff is being reiterated, but I'm wondering, I don't know, maybe Tim O'Brien, maybe Bloomberg have both been diligent in reporting on this before, but it seems like familiar territory for us, but a good update. Nonetheless, and another excuse to bring this stuff up. What is this shadowy business partnership? Could be any one of them, of course. This one is an insider description of the Bayrock Group. You'll remember them. Its links to the Trump family and its mysterious access to funds. It isn't pretty, says at least the headline writer over at Bloomberg. This is about Felix Sater and the Bayrock Group and all the craziness surrounding them. Let's see if there's anything new. I love the fact that it's new reporting for Bloomberg. You'll see what sort of details emerge in this one. If nothing else, it'll be a good reminder of what kind of nonsense Trump has been involved in. Oh, by the way, here's an interesting shot that they have here. The piece is illustrated with a photo of Trump and the partners in Bayrock. It's Felix Sater and what's the guy's first name? As is his last name here is Arif. I can't remember what his first name is. Felix, I remember. But at any rate, I'm certain that reading through the piece we'll get a clearer description, and we'll get the first name of Arif. It was Trump, Arif, and Sater. Sater is at right in this picture at the Trump Soho launch party in 2007. Again, just a reminder, you don't typically do launch parties for condos, but they do. But this picture caught my eye because here's Trump with the microphone, eyes closed, but blathering on as usual, blissfully unaware of anyone's later discovery of just how shady this whole thing is. But he's wearing one of his stupid ties that's way, way, way too long. But we get a rare glimpse. I guess this is before he discovered the Scotch tape thing. We get a rare glimpse of the shorter tail of the tie emerging from behind, and it's so far up that when I tie a tie, I mean, I'm not as tall as he is. That's true. That's going to make a big difference. But the tail of the tie extends, a good way down behind the front of the tie. And I suppose if you're taller, it's going to go less. But I mean, this thing, the stubby end of the tie is like halfway up the long end. And it doesn't even look like it's particularly long. I've seen longer on Trump. But anyway, it's distractingly long. Not to distract from the substance of the article, though. Let's get to some of that. The special counsel's investigation of the White House has come more sharply into focus, says O'Brien here. Robert Mueller is examining whether President Donald Trump obstructed justice when he fired James Comey as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Washington Post recently reported. As we've heard for months now, there is also a probe of possible collusion between Trump's campaign team and the Kremlin to tilt the 2016 election in the president's favor. But the Justice Department inquiry led by Mueller now has added flavors. The Post noted that the investigation also includes suspicious financial activity involving Russian operatives. The New York Times was more specific in its account, saying that Mueller is looking at whether Trump associates laundered financial payoffs from Russian officials by channeling them through offshore accounts. It sounds largely like the supposition we've been making all along. Trump has repeatedly labeled Comey's and Mueller's investigations witch hunts, and his lawyers have said that the last decade of his tax returns, which the president has declined to release, would show, they don't so far, but they would show that he has no income or loans from Russian sources. We, of course, know that not to be true, but whatever. In May, Trump told NBC that he has no property or investments in Russia. I am not involved in Russia, he said. Of course, Russia's involved in him. We've read the stories about how he's made or been on the receiving end of over $100 million worth of investment from Russian citizens, Russian operatives, and everything in between, just in one cluster of 7 condominium buildings in South Florida alone. Anyway, we'll stick to the coverage in this article. That doesn't address the national security and other problems that might arise for the president if Russia is involved in Trump, either through potentially compromising U.S. business relationships or through funds that flowed into his wallet years ago. In that context, a troubling history of Trump's dealings with Russians exists outside of Russia. In a dormant real estate development firm, the Bayrock Group, which once operated just 2 floors beneath the president's own office in Trump Tower. Bayrock partnered with the future president and his 2 eldest children, Donald Jr. and Ivanka, on a series of real estate deals between 2002 and about 2011, the most prominent being the troubled Trump Soho Hotel and Condominium in Manhattan. During the years that Bayrock and Trump did deals together, the company was also a bridge between murky European funding and a number of projects in the U.S. to which the president once lent his name in exchange for handsome fees. It's the most handsome thing going in that particular deal. Icelandic banks, remember these guys, that dealt with Bayrock, for example, were easy marks for money launderers and foreign influence, according to interviews with government investigators, legislators, and others in Reykjavik, Brussels, Paris, and London. Trump testified under oath in a 2007 deposition that Bayrock brought Russian investors to his Trump Tower office to discuss deals in Moscow and said he was pondering investing there. It's ridiculous that I wouldn't be investing in Russia, Trump said in that deposition, Russia is one of the hottest places in the world for investment. Why, it's just ridiculous to suppose he has no interest in Russia. One of Bayrock's principals was a career criminal named Felix Sater, who had ties to Russian and American organized crime groups. Before linking up with the company and with Trump, he had worked as a mob informant for the U.S. government, fled to Moscow to avoid criminal charges while boasting of his KGB and Kremlin contacts there, and had gone to prison for slashing apart another man's face with a broken cocktail glass. In a series of interviews and a lawsuit, a former Bayrock insider, Jody Criss, claims that he eventually departed from the firm because he became convinced that Bayrock was actually a front for money laundering. Criss has sued Bayrock, alleging that in addition to laundering money, the Bayrock team also skimmed cash from the operation. What? No way. Dodged taxes, we don't say, and cheated him out of millions of dollars. Now we get to the point. Sater and others at Bayrock would not comment for this column. In court documents, they have contested Chris's charges and describe him essentially as a disgruntled employee trying to shake them down. But Chris's assertion that Bayrock was a criminal operation during the years it partnered with Trump has been deemed plausible enough to earn him a court victory. In December, a federal judge in New York said Chris's lawsuit against Bayrock, which he first filed 9 years ago, could proceed as a racketeering case. It says here parenthetically, I have my own history in court with the president. Trump sued me in 2006 when I worked at the New York Times, alleging that my biography, Trump Nation, had misrepresented his business record and his wealth. Trump lost the suit in 2011. My lawyers deposed him and Sater as well during the litigation. Trump's representatives didn't respond to repeated interview requests for this column. Trump has said over the years that he barely knows Sater. In fact, Sater, who former employees at Bayrock say met frequently with Trump in the Trump Organization's New York headquarters, once shepherded the president's children around Moscow and carried a Trump Organization business card. Apparently, has remained firmly in the orbit of the president and his closest advisors. I barely know him. I just let him take my children to Moscow. Sater made the front page of the New York Times in February for his role in a failed effort, along with Trump's personal attorney, who now has to hire an attorney, Michael Cohen, to lobby former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who's a spy, on a Ukrainian peace proposal. Comey was still Trump's FBI director when he testified before the House Intelligence Committee in March about Russian interference in the 2016 election. During that hearing, Comey was asked if he was aware of Felix Sater, his criminal history, and his business dealings with the Trump Organization. Comey declined to comment. It's unclear whether Sater and Bayrock are part of Mueller's investigation, but Mueller has populated his investigative team with veteran prosecutors, expert in white-collar fraud and Russian organized crime probes. One of them, Andrew Weissman, once led an FBI team that examined financial fraud leading to the demise of Enron. Before that, Weissman was a prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn and a part of the team that prosecuted Sater and mob associates for investment scams in the late 1990s. However, the Mueller probe unfolds. A tour of Trump's partnership with Bayrock exposes a number of uncomfortable truths about the president's business history, his judgment, and the possible vulnerabilities that his past as a freewheeling deal-maker and his involvement with figures like Sater have visited upon his present as the nation's chief executive. Sater was born in the Soviet Union in 1966 and emigrated with his parents to the heavily Russian enclave of Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, when he was about 8 years old. He attended Pace University before dropping out when he was 18 and then found his way to Wall Street, where he worked as a stockbroker. His early years on Wall Street, according to the recollections of one of his one-time business partner, Salvatore Loria, were flush. By his mid-20s, Sater was collecting expensive watches, spending thousands of dollars on Xenia suits, and buying luxury cars. That all came to a brief halt in 1993 when he was sent to prison for using the stem of a broken margarita glass during a bar fight 2 years earlier to attack another stockbroker. Sater's victim needed 110 stitches to hold his face together. When Sater emerged from prison 15 months later, he found his way back into trouble with a group that included Loria, who admits to having had ties to organized crime figures and grew up in New York as a close friend of a prominent mafia boss. Sater opened an investment firm on the penthouse floor of 40 Wall Street, a Trump-owned building in Manhattan. You remember 40 Wall Street was the one that he used to defraud the city of New York of funding for 9/11 recovery. You remember that? And the tallest building and yada yada, all his bragging points as well. Anyway, from there, according to federal prosecutors, Sater and his team set about laundering money for the mob and fleecing about $40 million from unwitting and largely elderly investors, a number of whom were Holocaust survivors. That's an extra special inclusion there. By the time law enforcement authorities eventually caught on to the 40 Wall Street operation, Sater had fled to Russia. Loria visited him there, though, interestingly enough. Sater was always hustling and scheming, and his contacts in Russia were the same kind of contacts he had in the United States. Loria wrote in a 2003 memoir, The Scorpion and the Frog. The difference was that in Russia, his crooked contacts were links between Russian organized crime, the Russian military, the KGB, and operatives who played both ways, or sometimes three ways. Difficult to distinguish between the players in Russia at that time, and maybe still the case. Sater, who had been charged with racketeering and money laundering by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn in connection with the 40 Wall Street scam, eventually decided to return to America and face those charges. He had a card to play, however. His knowledge, gleaned from contacts in Russia about a small stock of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles loose on the black market in Afghanistan that were of interest to the U.S. intelligence officials. That's what he had to trade them with, right? So we were hoping for a free ride or a get-out-of-jail-free card for our crimes on Wall Street, Loria wrote of Sater's maneuvering with U.S. officials. Sater told authorities that he could use his Russian contacts to buy the Stingers, and according to court filings in Chris's lawsuit and other accounts, a deal was struck in December of 1998. Sater pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and then entered into a cooperation agreement with the government that sealed court records in the case and allowed his sentencing to be postponed for 11 years. Sater would ultimately only pay a $25,000 fine and never go to prison. Many years later, as part of her confirmation hearings to become President Barack Obama's Attorney General, Loretta Lynch would note that the cooperation deal she made with Sater when she was the U.S. Attorney in Brooklyn lasted for a decade, from 1998 to 2008, and that Sater gave the government information crucial to national security and the conviction of over 20 individuals, including those responsible for committing massive financial fraud and members of La Cosa Nostra. At some point after becoming an informant, Sater also recast himself as a real estate savant. Why not? Anybody can do that, right? He made his way to Manhattan real estate investment firm APC Realty, where he raised money for deals and where he met Chris in 2000. Chris, a native of Miami and a business graduate from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, was an aspiring real estate developer who was in his early 20s when they met. He says he was initially captivated by Sater. Felix knew how to be charming and knew how to be brutally nasty, says Chris. He has a talent for drawing people in. He has charm and charisma, but that's what con men do. And I don't know, for whatever reason, it seemed extraordinarily attractive to a Wharton School of Business graduate, and also this guy, Chris. I meant, of course, Donald Trump. Strange that the business school didn't seem to instill any particular code of ethics on these two guys in particular. I don't know. Maybe they do much better with everybody else. My dad went to Wharton. He seems ordinarily pretty ethical, don't you think? Okay, well, you wouldn't know. Well, you take my word for it. After APC began to fall apart in 2002, Chris decided to strike out on his own back home in Miami, doing real estate deals. Sater made his way to a small Hong Kong investment bank, sure, why not, that used him as a New York-based rainmaker for real estate deals. In addition to his new life as a real estate investor and government informant, Sater owned a comfortable home in Sands Point, Long Island, a Tony, New York suburb that was the setting for The Great Gatsby. He also had a wife and 3 daughters and was a member of an Orthodox synagogue in neighboring Port Washington. On one occasion, Sater brought his rabbi with him to meet U.S. intelligence officials in New York, where, the rabbi said, agents praised Sater's service to the country. Always hate these deals, but who knows what's being obtained in the bargain by federal prosecutors. Anyway, interesting. I guess nobody suspects the Orthodox folks who bring their rabbis everywhere. I wonder why Jared Kushner is so insistent on all of us thinking that he's a strictly observant Orthodox Jew, even though he makes claims anyway about special dispensations that no rabbi will admit to giving him for scheduling flights to Saudi Arabia on Shabbat. And P.S. he loves playing golf on Saturdays too. Anyway, when Sater received a community service award at his synagogue on another occasion, a band played Hail to the Chief. I wonder why they would do that. Sater gave an acceptance speech in which he noted that he was not a very religious person, but that his goal in life was to repair the world or make it a better place. That's nice. About a year after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, Sater joined Bayrock, a company that marketed itself as a property developer and had opened Manhattan offices on the 24th floor of a well-known building at 725 Fifth Avenue, Trump Tower. In late 2002, Sater phoned Chris and invited him to consult at Bayrock, bragging about a deep-pocketed investor, Tevfik Arif, who was partnering with him in search of bigger deals. Arif, born in Kazakhstan, was a former Soviet official who had relocated to Turkey to make his fortune. He ran several upscale seaside hotels there that catered almost exclusively to Russians, according to Chris, and he had also redeveloped a shopping center in Brooklyn. At one point in his post-Soviet years, Arif also reportedly took over a former Kazakh state-owned chromium producer with his brother. Like Sater, Arif had a home in Sands Point, and Chris says that Arif brought his children there from Turkey to learn English. Arif's representatives declined to respond to a list of questions about his business history, including how he met Sater and brought him to Bayrock, citing ongoing litigation. Bayrock was initially funded, in part, with a $10 million investment transferred to the firm by Arif's brother in Russia, who, according to Chris's lawsuit, was able to tap into the cash reserves of a Kazakh chromium refinery. That very same one, I guess. A spokeswoman for Arif declined to comment on that allegation. A marketing document Bayrock once circulated to prospective investors noted that Alexander Mashkevich, I don't know whether it's Mashkevich or Mashkevich, an oligarch born in the former Soviet Union, you'll never believe it, was one of Bayrock's primary sources of funding. Mashkevich's firm, the Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation, was based in Kazakhstan and elsewhere and had interests in chromium. Wow, weird. Aluminum, coal, construction, and banking. A person close to Mashkevich, who requested anonymity because of the Chris Bayrock litigation, said Mashkevich was never invested in Bayrock. Bayrock never seemed to be short of money, however. According to Chris's lawsuit, the team running the little development firm in Trump Tower could locate funds month after month for 2 years, in fact more frequently whenever Bayrock ran out of cash. If times got tight, Bayrock's owners would magically show up with a wire from somewhere just large enough to keep the company going. Chris said that Sater and Arif wooed him to Bayrock by offering him 10% of the firm's profits. Bayrock's Trump Tower offices gave it an air of success, or rather gave an air of success to it, Chris says, Bayrock also gave Chris, then 28 years old, the opportunity to work with Trump. It was Sater who initially developed the relationship with Trump, according to Chris and court records from Trump's lawsuits against me. That would be Timothy O'Brien, who wrote the piece. Sater has made the acquaintance of 3 Trump Organization executives who then introduced him to their boss. When the Bayrock team met Trump in 2002, the future president was enduring a long stretch in the financial wilderness, having narrowly escaped personal bankruptcy in the early 1990s. He eventually emerged from that mess as a pariah among big banks. He was also a determined survivor and tireless self-promoter, and he parlayed those skills into recreating himself as a branding machine and golf course developer in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Chris said that it was Arif and Sater who pitched the future president on the idea of launching an international chain of Trump-branded mixed-use hotels and condominiums. And Bayrock got to Trump at a time when his brand could help get a little extra attention for a condo project, but didn't amount to much more than that. Trump was trying to build his brand, and Bayrock was trying to market it, Chris recalls. It wasn't clear who needed each other more. This was before the show, remember. The show, of course, was The Apprentice. It aired for the first time on January 8th, 2004, and became a sensation that vaulted Trump into TV reality stardom. In the real world, Trump's casinos were faltering, but on reality TV, Trump posed as a successful leader and dealmaker who embodied a certain kind of entrepreneurial flair and over-the-top billionairedom, an impression that stuck with tens of millions of TV viewers. The popularity of The Apprentice also gave the Bayrock-Trump partnership added zing. That put Bayrock in a great position once the show debuted, Chris said. The show did it for Trump, man. Nobody was interested in licensing his name before that. The hook at Bayrock for Trump was an 18% equity stake in what became the Trump Soho Hotel, a steady stream of management fees on all Bayrock projects, and the ability to plaster his name on properties without having to invest a single dollar of his own. It's not clear how carefully Trump vetted his Bayrock partners, but his lack of concern about their background and the potential risk to his own reputation from dealing with them was part of a pattern. In Atlantic City, he had partnered with men in organized crime, or with organized crime ties anyway. Later, he and his children struck deals in Brazil and Azerbaijan with partners who had murky backgrounds or unusual legal entanglements. Sater said in court filings that he disclosed his securities fraud conviction to members of the Trump Organization. He assumed they had told Trump, but he wasn't sure. It's not very hard to get connected to Donald if you make it known that you have a lot of money and you want to do deals and you want to put his name on it. Abe Wallach, who was the future president's right-hand man at the Trump Organization from 1990 to about 2002, told me in an interview. Donald doesn't do due diligence. He relies on his gut and whether he thinks you have good genes, which could mean anything, I guess. Given Arif's halting English, it was Sater and Chris who interacted most frequently with the Trump family, and Sater the most often with Trump himself. Chris says that most of his contacts there were with the elder Trump children, Don Jr. and Ivanka, and included drafting contracts and occasional nights on the town. While Trump's kids were involved in the back and forth with Bayrock, it was Trump himself who always had the final say. Donald was always in charge, says Chris. Donald had to agree to every term of every deal and had to sign off on everything. Nothing happened unless he said it was okay to do it. And even if Donald Jr. shook your hand on a deal, he came back downstairs to renegotiate if his father told him to. The Trumps, Chris says, saw Sater frequently and valued the relationship because Felix demonstrated that he was loyal to them. He says that at one point, Sater was meeting with the future president in his Trump Tower office multiple times a week. Sater, according to later court deposition, said that his business conversations with Trump in that office were wide-ranging and frequent on a constant basis. The pair had what Sater described as real estate conversations, and they talked about gathering intelligence, gathering know-how, general market discussions, and also chatted about using Sater's Russian connections to build a high-rise in the center of Moscow. That would be a great opportunity, mega financial home run. Although Sater socialized with Trump, I wouldn't call him my friend, he said in the 2008 deposition. No one wants to call anybody else a friend in a deposition, but okay. Still, Sater said he traveled with Trump to look at deals and was proud of Bayrock's relationship with the famous developer. Anybody can come in and build a tower, he said. I can build a Trump tower because of my relationship with Trump. Bayrock and the Trumps then began laying the groundwork for domestic and international condo hotel projects, eventually exploring deals in Turkey, Poland, and Ukraine. Sater escorted Ivanka and Don Jr. on a trip to Moscow, where they looked at land for a Trump-branded hotel. None of those overseas projects got past the planning stages. In the U.S., Bayrock and Trump projects moved forward haltingly. In Phoenix, a one-story mall that Bayrock bought out of bankruptcy was meant to be the site of a Trump-branded tower. It became ensnared in zoning disputes and the national real estate downturn and never got built. Sater's dealings in Phoenix later landed him in court with the local developer who had invested in the Phoenix project, Ernest Meniz. I think we have mentioned this guy's name before. Meniz, M-E-N-N-E-S, said in a lawsuit that when he threatened to reveal Sater's criminal record, Sater told him that he would have a cousin electrically shock Mr. Meniz's testicles, cut off Mr. Meniz's legs, and leave Mr. Meniz dead in the trunk of his car. That sounds legitimate. I think most businessmen have. Who hasn't threatened that? In Meniz's lawsuit against Bayrock and Sater, he alleged that Sater also skimmed money from the Phoenix development. Bayrock and Sater settled the suit, which was later sealed and its terms left undisclosed. Sater's lawyer, in an interview with ABC News, denied Meniz's allegations. The next project Trump and Bayrock pursued was the Trump International Hotel and Tower, a mixed-use hotel and condominium in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Announced in 2005, it later went into foreclosure. The third and final project Bayrock and Trump worked on together was their most high-profile effort, the 46-story Trump Soho Hotel in Lower Manhattan. Trump, Sater, and Arif were all photographed together at a splashy launch party for the Trump Soho in 2007. Trump also pitched the Trump Soho on an episode of The Apprentice, promising that this brilliant $370 million work of art will be an awe-inspiring masterpiece. Helping Trump and Bayrock fund that masterpiece was a fresh influx of money from an Icelandic investment bank called the FL Group. Sater and Luria, his longtime mob associate, had jointly recruited FL, introducing the firm to Bayrock and the Trump Organization. I'll have more on the FL Group and Bayrock in a future column. The firm's former leaders, one of whom was later convicted of tax fraud and accounting fraud, declined to comment or did not respond to interview requests for this column. Yet again, the Trump Organization, even though it signed off on the FL agreement, appeared to care little about vetting a firm that came into the partnership through Sater. FL operated in a country with a porous, vulnerable banking system, and some investigators who scrutinized other Icelandic banks at the time said they suspected those banks of being conduits, unwitting or otherwise, for dirty funds from outside Iceland. The FL Group collapsed a little over a year after it invested in Bayrock. The firm itself was never prosecuted, and the leaders of a number of other Icelandic banks were prosecuted for or jailed for crimes including money laundering. Chris said in an interview that an Icelandic competitor of the FL Group also contacted him to invest in Bayrock. When he took that offer to Sater and Arif, they told him, he says, that the money behind Icelandic banks was mostly Russian, and that they had to take FL's funds for deals they were doing with Trump because the investment firm was closer to Putin. I thought it was a lie or a joke when they said Putin, Chris recalls. I didn't know how to make sense of it all. Chris says he doesn't have financial records showing the Russian President Vladimir Putin had a connection to the FL group and that his own knowledge is purely anecdotal. Kremlin spokesman said via email that Putin had no connection to the FL group or Bayrock. Chris says that in the wake of the FL deal, he was owed a payout that could have ranged from about $4 million to $10 million, but that Bayrock reneged. When he persisted, he claims Sater threatened him. So Chris said he accepted a $500,000 payment instead and then eventually quit. Sater, it turns out, didn't have much time left at Bayrock either. In December of 2007, the New York Times published an article detailing some of Sater's past run-ins with the law and some of his ties to organized crime. The article also noted that Sater had begun using Satter, S-A-T-T-E-R, 2 T's in that one, as an alternative spelling for his last name so he could try to distance himself from his past if people Googled him. 2 days after the Times story ran, Trump sat for a deposition with my attorneys as part of the libel lawsuit he had filed against me for Trump Nation. They asked him whether he planned to sever his relationship with Sater because of Sater's organized crime ties. Trump said he hadn't made up his mind. Have you ever previously associated with people you knew were members of organized crime? One of my lawyers asked. No, I haven't, Trump responded, and it's hard to overly blame Bayrock. Things like that can happen. But I want to see what action Bayrock takes before I make a decision. In fact, Trump had partnered in the past in Atlantic City's real estate business with men he knew were mobbed up. Whenever he was asked in later years about his relationship with Sater, Trump routinely misrepresented it as distant. In a 2013 deposition taken as part of litigation surrounding Trump and Bayrock's failed Fort Lauderdale project, Trump was asked again about his partnership with Sater. He was supposedly very close to the government of the United States, as a witness or something, Trump said. I don't think he was connected to the mafia. He got into trouble because he got into a barroom fight. I don't know him very well, Trump added, saying that he hadn't conversed very often with Sater. If he were sitting in the room right now, I really wouldn't know what he looked like. Trump also said that he didn't think the questions about Sater's background meant that he should have ended his business partnership with him. Somebody said that he's in the mafia. What am I going to do? Shortly after my lawyers asked Trump about Sater, Bayrock began discussing the best way for him to resign, according to company emails and court records. By 2008, Sater had left the firm. The Trump Soho ended in failure. It opened in 2010, but many units failed to sell, and early condo purchasers sued Bayrock and the Trumps. That's interesting to note. I just want to reiterate that, by the way. It opened in 2010, but the launch party was 2007. Basically, that means they had a party for deciding to begin construction on this building that wasn't completed and opened for 3 years. 3 years after that, I guess, the Trump Soho went into foreclosure with most of its units still unsold, and a new company took control of the property. Bayrock hasn't done another deal since then. A spokeswoman for Bayrock attributed the failures to the Trump partnerships to fallout from the 2008 financial meltdown. But imagine this as the biggest deal he did with these guys. In 2007, he has a launch party for it. In 2010, the place finally opens. By 2013, it's in foreclosure with most of the units empty. What a genius businessman. After Chris left Bayrock, he set up his own development firm in New York and then sued Sater, Arif, Trump, and Bayrock in Delaware in 2008, alleging that Bayrock was a criminal enterprise and demanding to be paid in full for his work there. When the case moved to New York in 2010, it came with a twist. Sater had left a copy of his cooperation deal with the government, the one dating back to his Stinger missile and mob informant days, on the hard drive of his Bayrock computer. A Bayrock employee leaked it to Chris's attorney, who promptly filed it as an exhibit in court. Trump was eventually dropped from the case, and Sater began carpet bombing Chris with his own lawsuits, ultimately filing several separate actions that claimed, among other things, that Chris had used the courts to prosecute him maliciously. Sater also apparently kept busy outside the courtroom. Chris says that about 3 years ago he started receiving threatening emails from websites carrying versions of his name, jchrisinfo.com, for example. He soon discovered that there were hundreds of other new websites that also contained false, disparaging information about him. Chris sued the anonymous authors of the websites for defamation, and when the court ruled in his favor, he was able to get a large portion of the sites delisted from Google. He also says he was able to use the court order to untangle the provenance of the websites, discovering that their registration tracked back to Sater's home address in Sands Point. That seems coincidental. Chris says that goons once showed up at a real estate development he was overseeing in Brooklyn, asking his employers if they knew the true story about their boss. Waves of letters questioning his bona fides have arrived at his office and in the mailboxes of every resident in 2 separate buildings where Chris kept apartments. Chris says investors in his new company, East River Partners, have stood by him, but he's worried that Sater's digital vendetta may be hard to overcome. His new lawyer, Bradley Simon, says that he's mystified by how Sater has managed to stay afloat all these years. Sater was a cooperating witness for the Eastern District of New York, and he continued going on a crime rampage at the same time, says Simon. He filed all kinds of frivolous lawsuits, but that's what he does. He seems to have unlimited funds. For his part, Sater continues to wear many hats. A couple of years after he left Bayrock, the Trump Organization hired him briefly as a consultant to prospect for real estate deals, giving him company business cards with his name engraved on them, which is exactly what you want to give to the guy whose every project has been a failure or landed him in jail. More recently, Sater got enmeshed in litigation again, this time around the sale of an Ohio shopping mall and the alleged disappearance of tens of millions of dollars in a court case that was settled in 2013. Sater has also entered into a war of words with his former Bayrock partner Tevfik Arif. Sater claims, according to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, that Arif owes him money and that if he isn't paid, he'll publicize what he describes as Arif's ties to organized crime and to tainted dealings in Kazakhstan's metals business. A Bayrock spokeswoman says that Sater's claims about Arif are baseless. Meanwhile, Trump is mired in a new probe that now pivots off other sensitive topics for him and his family, their money, their deals, and Russia, all of which will test his promise to testify under oath to Mueller and his investigators. Wow. Well, that's some kind of wrap-up. I mean, I don't think we learned anything in particular that was new except for the fact that the Mueller investigators are turned on to this. There was a little bit of additional information, but a good reminder, and of course putting it in the context of the kind of investigation that Mueller is now pursuing. It would be really interesting to see them come up with this. Still waiting for Mueller to express any interest, and I doubt he ever will, in the whole child molestation thing and his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But I guess everybody's still worried that that will somehow embarrass the Clintons. But to hell with that. I want to know just what happened there. Fingers crossed for that, but I don't think that's anytime soon going to enter into Mueller's sights. You never know, though. We'll see. Shifting gears just slightly, another Donald Trump is incompetent and ought to be thrown out of office story. This one shared with our friend Canuck Pundit, our Canadian pundit pal Brian, who shared this story from the Toronto Star. This was just sort of an interesting sort of, we'll take one step to the side and give us an oblique angle on what's wrong with Trump and what to do about it, or what to watch out for when you're trying to figure out what to do about it. Richard Evans has written this piece, I guess originally for Foreign Policy, but being run in the Star here. The Madness of King Donald Trump. I've heard the comparisons made before to that, to the madness of King George, and I think it's apt in certain ways. The Madness of King Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States. That part might not be true. But his aggrandizing and self-defeating leadership, conducted via a modern royal court, suggests Trump may be unfit for office. He is, but that also helps suggest it. Yes, the history of removing incompetent regal rulers shows that it is those closest to him who bear the closest watching. I think that's a great warning. The photo of him is hilarious. I think he's standing in front of I don't know where he is, but it looks like he's in front of a large-scale representation of maybe the Congressional Medal of Honor or something, and then there's a seal behind him, but it makes it look like he's got giant golden wings sprouting from his neck. Not his hair, but giant eagle's wings. You'll see when you take a look at this thing. Let me just jump right into this. This does sound like a good warning and an apt comparison. Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, maybe, has not been in office for very long, but already the contours and characteristics of his rule have become clear. Rather than govern conventionally through officers of state appointed for their competence and experience, and with the agreement, however reluctant, of Congress, he has chosen to gather around him an informal coterie of friends, advisors, and relatives, yes, many of them like himself without any experience in government at all, while railing against the restrictions imposed on him by constitutional arrangements such as the independence of the press and the judiciary. Trump's entourage resembles nothing more closely than the court of a hereditary monarch, with informal structures of rule elbowing aside more formal ones. Trump did, after all, win widespread support in the electorate by promising precisely this: shaking up, bypassing, or overthrowing the Washington establishment and trying something new. Of course, I would note for the record, and I think he'd probably agree, there's nothing new about this. This is very old, and we overthrew that in favor of what we have. But okay, it's different, it's just not new. But I'll forgive that slip. The result, however, has been chaos and confusion. I know Greg would agree with that. Contradiction and paralysis. It has become clear that the President of the United States is someone who does not read his briefs, who does not take the advice of experts in the intelligence field or indeed in any other, who fires off brief statements without thinking whether they are consistent with his administration's declared policies, who is seemingly incapable of putting together a coherent sentence with a subject, a verb, and an object, who is apt to give away state secrets to a foreign power, and who seems to have no respect either for the truth or for the Constitution, not least in respect of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. He may not be mad. It's possible. But a growing number of commentators allege that Trump is suffering from dementia, or is mentally subnormal, or is suffering from a personality disorder of some kind. I would say also some combination of the above is possible. In a situation where a head of state is incapable of carrying out his duties properly, what guidance can history offer us? The relevant history isn't so much the history of the presidency of the United States, where no incumbent has ever been successfully removed from office by Congress, but rather the history of incompetent or allegedly incompetent rulers at other times and in other parts of the world. What happens when a political elite concludes that the real or titular head of state has to be deposed in the interests of the country as a whole? Of course, given Trump's leadership style, the pertinent question might be narrowed down further. What happens when a monarch is judged as mentally unfit to rule? In modern times, just as further back in history, madness is a slippery concept, hard to pin down unless there are obvious signs of delusion, derangement, paranoia, or actual physical aggression. But madness of that sort was far from uncommon in Europe's royal families, not least because of the inbreeding favored by their convention that members of a royal family could not marry beneath their station. As H.C. Eric Middlefort explains, I'm just going to take your word for it on that one, in his entertaining 1996 monograph, Mad Princes of Renaissance Germany, which does sound like a compelling title, doesn't it? In 16th century Germany, nearly 30 dukes, landgraves, and counts were regarded by their courts and ministers as mad enough to require medical attention or removal from office. But what exactly was meant by mad? Middelfert explains that advisors and family members spoke of weakness, folly, debility, and the condition of not being right, whatever that might mean, or sometimes furor or melancholy or sickness when they encountered princes who seemed to be mentally unsuited to rule. The notion of clinical insanity or certifiable madness is one that only became current in the 19th century. In the early modern period, few princes were clearly completely deranged, such as Don Julius Caesar de Austria, son of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who tortured his mistress to death and walked about for days covered in her blood and brains, attacked his servants, destroyed his furniture, tore up his clothing, babbled and roared nonsensically, and was, allegedly, eventually strangled on his father's orders in 1609. Them was early days. Wow. You don't get a lot of that history here in the United States. Anyway, some suffered from delusions, such as Duke Albrecht Friedrich of Prussia, who slept in his clothes in case the Turks came for him in the night. Okay. Poured his medicines on the floor. Well, I've seen people do that as well. Spoke to people who were not present in the room, and threw a clock at an envoy sent by Emperor Maximilian II. That's a closer call. Relatives were appointed to carry out the business of ruling, bypassing the unfortunate Duke, who was left to amuse himself with his collection of 100,000 coins while being subjected to a variety of grotesque cures applied by rival schools of medicine. That doesn't sound very good either. More commonly, however, was melancholy, or as we would put it today, depression, sometimes attributed in the medieval or early period to demonic influences, and debilitation from such melancholy, or through paralysis or speech impediments caused by strokes, senility, dementia, and other afflictions of old age, were typically dealt with by finding someone else to rule without actually deposing the prince. But not always. Consider the example of the 1848 revolutions in Central Europe. Yes, why don't you? Well, let's begin to do that. The fact that the Austrian Empire's ruler, Ferdinand I, was barely capable of carrying out his duties had been known from the moment he came to the throne, following the normal line of hereditary succession in the House of Habsburg. Stories of his limited intellectual capacity were legion. When he was told one day that he could not have apricot dumplings because they were out of season, he lost his temper. "I'm the emperor," he shouted at his cook, "and I want dumplings." Sounds like a fairy tale story, really. I mean, not out of keeping with regular practice. But okay, we'll take your word for it. I'll let the Austrians tell me more about that. They were close to the problem. The offspring of double first cousins, his parents, in other words, shared all four grandparents. He was slow to learn to read and write, subject to epileptic fits, had a speech impediment, and was clearly incapable of carrying out his imperial duties. When he came to the throne in 1835, the country's leading statesman, Prince Clemens von Metternich, ensured that the business of the emperor was carried out by a council consisting of himself, another politician, and the emperor's uncle, Archduke Louis. But the situation could not stave off the revolution that came in 1848. And as the crowds marched toward the imperial palace in Vienna, Ferdinand summoned Metternich and asked, "What are all those people doing there, then?" "They are making a revolution," Metternich replied. It's awfully level-headed of you there, Clemens. What are they allowed to do that? Ferdinand asked in astonishment. Not surprisingly, as the revolution took a grip, he was persuaded by his family to abdicate in favor of his 18-year-old nephew, who became Franz Joseph I. The Habsburgs were always optimists, but there never was a Ferdinand II or a Franz Joseph II. By the way, as Franz Joseph was defeated by Otto von Bismarck's Prussian armies in the War of 1866, Ferdinand had the last laugh. Really. I don't know why they appointed Franz Joseph. He is said to have remarked, I could have been just as good at losing battles. He's sharper than you thought. The Habsburg Empire in the mid-19th century was in a desperate situation, requiring desperate remedies, which is why the hapless Ferdinand accepted his deposition, if with great reluctance. In the case of monarchical incapacity, deposition was seldom resorted to because a general belief in the divine right of kings got in the way. If God had put the monarch on the throne, and the belief was a central part of monarchical legitimacy, then only God could remove him. Mere humans had no right to do so. So, in more normal times, when the political structure as a whole was not under threat, abdication was typically avoided. It was usual instead to appoint a regent to take care of royal business when the monarch became incapacitated, as, for example, during the few weeks in 1878 when the German Kaiser Wilhelm I was recovering from a nearly successful assassination attempt. Regents assumed all the powers of the monarch, not just the title of king. The most famous appointment of a regent was to King George III after he began talking to trees. Trees won't answer you. Come on, talk to goats and sheep. After he began talking to trees and speaking continuously to nobody in particular for hours on end in the early 19th century. In a rare moment of lucidity, he agreed he was no longer capable of ruling, and in 1811 conceded the appointment by Act of Parliament of his eldest son George as Prince Regent. The Prince Regent, who later became King George IV on his father's death, was not exactly a model monarch either. Addicted to opium. That's a tough thing. Boy, that opioid crisis, it's hitting everywhere. Even, I don't think it was Buckingham Palace at the time. Where did the St. George Palace, maybe at that point? Who knows? Gideon, you probably know. Tell me later. Addicted to opium, a heavy drinker and a gluttonous eater, he weighed 245 pounds and had a 50-inch waistline. Donald Trump. He's Trump all over. His extravagance and drunkenness made him unpopular, although, these days maybe that would make him popular. I don't know. And his brother, William IV, who succeeded him in 1830 at the age of 64, the oldest person to come to the throne so far, was accustomed to wander the streets off on his own, going up to ordinary citizens to speak to them. I'm the king, you know. The courtier and diarist Charles Greville declared that William IV made a number of speeches so ridiculous and nonsensical beyond all belief, but to those who heard them, rambling from one subject to another, repeating the same thing over and over again, and altogether such a mass of confusion, trash, and imbecility as made one laugh and blush at the same time. Greville thought the king was mad, and indeed the monarch was known as Silly Billy by the populace at large. I actually did know that. Amazing. Anyway, there's more. But the British monarchy of the early 19th century, for all the weakness of its incumbents, survived because by this stage of history, the kings and queens of England had very little real power. Over time, leading politicians became less hesitant to transgress alleged monarchical power that was no longer extant. It was not long before the idea of a regency fell entirely out of favor in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. When a British monarch transgressed the largely unwritten rules of the job, as King Edward VIII did in 1936 by declaring his intention of marrying an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. How crazy is that? Also, he was into Nazis, but whatever. The politicians had little difficulty in simply removing him from the throne. Europe's last enactment of a regency was in the case of King Otto of Bavaria, younger brother of the eccentric Ludwig II, builder of the fairy castles of, Neuschwanstein and Hohenschwangau. My goodness. Germany. How dare you? On Ludwig's unexplained and sudden death, Otto succeeded to the throne, but succumbed rapidly to a deep and incurable depression, probably caused by syphilis. He was paralyzed during the final period of his life. a prince regent, Otto's uncle Luitpold, took over for Otto, ruling from 1886 to 1912, followed by a cousin, Ludwig, who quickly got the Bavarian parliament to depose Otto and declared himself king, just in time for World War I. Anyway, in a situation such as this, the royal family's role was at least as important as that of the political elite. Both had a strong interest in ensuring the business of government was carried on in the usual way, just not by the existing monarch. The most favored way of removing from office a monarch who had shown himself to be unfit to rule has indeed in modern times been abdication at the behest of leading politicians, usually with the support of the royal family. After the Ottoman Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed by his ministers because of incompetence, his chosen successor, his nephew, Murad V, threw himself into a pool in the palace gardens, shouting to the guards to save him from assassination, and was reported to have vomited continuously for a day and night in sheer terror. Yikes. He had reason to be frightened. Within a few days, it was implausibly reported that Abdulaziz had committed suicide by cutting both his wrists simultaneously with a pair of scissors. Within a few months, Murad V was deposed by a coalition of family members and government ministers amid allegations of paranoia and schizophrenia, and imprisoned for the rest of his life. Yow. 2 assassinations of Ottoman sultans in a single year would have aroused too many public suspicions. The young man was probably glad to be relieved of the burdens and cares of royal office, although, I don't know, imprisonment kind of sucks. But I guess there's royal imprisonment and then there's other kinds. Anyway, I don't know how they did it there. What would happen? Now we got to get back to the point. What would happen if a monarch does not cooperate with political elites who consider him deranged? In that case, removal by force becomes an option, though sometimes it can only be effected through the intervention of a foreign power. This is what occurred to the self-styled Emperor Bokassa of what is now the Central African Republic in 1979. Bokassa had himself come to power in a military coup and almost immediately dissolved the National Assembly and banned all political parties except his own. It's not a good sign. Until that point, his career was similar to that of any other tin pot dictator, but he soon began to show signs of, megalomania. In 1976, he had himself crowned emperor in a lavish ceremony that cost a third of his impoverished country's annual budget. His extravagant pseudo-Napoleonic display and absurd self-awarded titles earned him the mockery of the rest of the world, but there was a darker side to his rule. He arrested, tortured, and personally murdered many of his opponents. He killed a number of school children who had thrown rocks at his car in protest against their families being forced to buy expensive school uniforms with a picture of his head on them from a firm owned by one of his many wives. Oh, can you imagine multiple wives in the current Trump situation? Oof, what a disaster. I mean, he essentially has that anyway, and then all the multiple children from those multiple wives, but at least he does. He's married to them one at a time. We can at least say that. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't make any damn difference. Anyway, what may have done him in were the lurid allegations that he had eaten the bodies of some of his victims. Now, would that sink Trump? We already know that he doesn't think shooting somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue would do it. Eating them. Well, let's not let it come to that. Anyway, eating his victims was, I guess, what finally did him in. Or more specifically, that he had cooked and served up to the visiting president of France. Oh my God, his political enemies. Well, that's not, I don't think that's in the works. But surely if Donald Trump murdered political enemies and served them to the president of France or any other country. Really, it doesn't have to be France. I assume that would do it. Unless, I don't know. Well, you can never tell. Congress, I mean, they're foodies. Maybe they would like it. I got no idea. The Republicans are they're a very dangerous crowd. Afterward, in 1986, he was deposed and arrested by a military expedition sent from France That'll teach you. To restore order in its former colony. It had nothing to do with the meal necessarily. And then put on trial in the Central African Republic. Found guilty on charges of murder and many other offenses, but not including cannibalism. So we can't even claim that was the reason. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but subsequently released on amnesty in 1993. How do you release that guy? Meanwhile, his mental state deteriorated still further until, within a few years, he was claiming to be the 13th apostle of Christ. But not hungry. So, Emperor Bokassa's power was not only real, it was absolute. And in general, it is a fairly obvious point that the more actual political power a monarch possesses, the more difficult he is to remove through legal means, and the more likely it is, therefore, that he will be coerced into abdicating, whether by his own subject or by outsiders. Well, I guess it'll have to be coerced into abdicating. If we look back beyond the 19th and 20th centuries to more remote periods of history, we encounter many such examples. One of very few monarchs to have earned madness as a title, the 16th century Spanish queen Juana la Loca, that'll do it. That came after, of course, the madness. I would assume. Otherwise, it's really just, that would be literally a self-fulfilling prophecy. Totally unfair to poor Queen Juana. Anyway, she was dealt with by being forcibly confined to a nunnery. An earlier insane monarch, Charles the Mad of France, who probably didn't even get served anybody at all, was not actually deposed, but after he murdered several of his entourage without warning in 1392, when you could do such things, he was pushed aside by his wife and his closest male relatives and completely excluded from power. This was just as well, since his madness grew more pronounced and manifested itself in disagreeable episodes. More so than this? I don't know. Such as his refusal to wash or change his clothes for several months in 1405. But I don't know how uncommon that really was in 1405. The murder, but still, people did it. Beheading everybody. In 1392, that was probably not all that uncommon. But it wasn't well received. That's the point. The optics. Yes, there we go. Chris Silicius of Paris at the time used to observe on the optics of murdering several members of your entourage, and he was not wrong. History is littered with scores, even hundreds of examples of coups d'etat, revolutions, rebellions, and revolts, assassinations, murders, and other ways of overthrowing a monarch, including, I was wondering, what else? The rebellions, assassinations, murders, what's left? Imprisonment and banishment. Okay. Very true. Not as exciting. I was going to, what other ones have they got? Opening one of those spring-loaded cans of peanut brittle that turns out to have a snake inside and giving them a heart attack? What do they got? Okay, imprisonment and banishment. But more often than not, such incidents are political in nature, the outcome of intense rivalries of one kind or another, from family feuds to ideological upheavals. True. All very true, and all you got to do is watch the various dramatizations of the Wars of the Roses, conducted in English, conveniently enough, for those of us here in the United States ignorant of the rest of the world's history, like me. Glad you have documented that for us nicely. Constitutional systems have the great advantage of channeling such rivalries into legal provisions that are almost always already in place, providing for the dismissal, impeachment, or prosecution of politicians. American legal scholars have argued, for instance, that the 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution, you've heard of it, which allows for the removal of a president unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, would apply in the instance of a mental debilitation. But a note of caution is required. Donald Trump has proven unwilling to play by the rules or respect the Constitution of the country that elected him. That puts a fine point on it, doesn't it? It's a bit on the nose there, as they say, but that isn't necessarily proof of insanity. It may just be a demonstration of his commitment to populism, which consists in showing precisely such disrespect to convention. I don't know that it's a populist convention to disrespect the Constitution, but rules are for nerds. I guess we could attribute that to some kind of populism. Populists' contempt for the rules and conventions of politics generally gets them into trouble if they ever succeed in assuming power. A case in point is the Hamburg judge Ronald Schill, whose upstart right-wing party won 20% of the vote in state elections in 2001 and entered a coalition government with the moderate conservative Christian Democrats. Schill, that's some name, announced he would cut crime by 50%, called for the legalization of cannabis, that is crazy, demanded that sex offenders be castrated, and urged the use of poison gas to paralyze hostage takers. Not a tactful suggestion in post-war Germany. Okay, good point. Parents who did not bring up their children the, quote, right way should be jailed, he said. After denouncing German politicians in general for incompetence, he was removed from office, his electoral support collapsed, and he fled to South America, where all right-wing German lunatics flee after being deposed from power. What is going on in South America? Where he secretly was filmed by a German tabloid newspaper snorting cocaine. That is interesting. Okay, an additional bit of news there. Not smoking crack like Rob Ford, but okay. Schill was not insane. That's what it says. He was merely incapable of following the rules of German politics. I mean, way incapable. Like other populists, he had gained support because he promised not to play by the rules. But the rules are usually there for good reason. For example, to prevent nepotism. We know what that is, of course, appointing family members as government officials and advisors. To stop corruption, and they're defining some of these things, using office for private gain. I think we know what that means. Or to ensure a reasonable measure of consistency and responsibility in the formulation and announcement of policy. If a government is run by someone who ignores these rules, it rapidly loses in coherence and influence, both at home and abroad. It is inevitable in such situations that others in the government will ask themselves what can be done to protect it. The only formal and legal way of removing U.S. President Trump and restoring strong and stable government is by impeachment. But, as with many other aspects of the 18th century Constitution by which the United States is still governed, thank you for noticing, this may prove a long, complicated, and difficult process. Republican members of Congress are understandably reluctant to spend many months removing a Republican president. And in the end, an attempt at impeachment may not succeed. But that still leaves other options. If Trump rules through what is in effect the modern American equivalent of a royal court, then perhaps it is the courtiers, and as in so many examples from history, together with his family, who might have to get together and remove him, or at the very least, neutralize him. The incoherence and inconsistency of his tweets and his speeches, unless they are written for him in advance, and unless he sticks rigidly to the text, has prompted speculation that this has happened already. Only a few weeks into his presidency, Steve Bannon was being described by many journalists as President Bannon. Now that he himself seems to have been sidelined, it looks increasingly as if Trump's family, with Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump alternating at the fore, is beginning to take over the show. Not so much real evidence of that, I don't think, but okay. If Americans prove incapable of deposing their debilitated president, they may soon earn the mild relief of one or more informally appointed American regents. That's a very interesting comparison to make, I think, and well taken, just as a warning. What I didn't see followed up on so much was the hint from the sub-headline, I guess, of the piece, pointing out that those closest to him bear the closest watching. I think he gets at it by saying, noting how people were calling Steve Bannon President Bannon and noting the rise of Jared Kushner and all that. I would develop that idea just a little bit further and note that those closest to him because of this sort of historical example, granted the historical examples are from overseas, and we don't often tend to consciously adopt foreign legal practice. I mean, it's an actual policy backlash among conservatives and the Trump base against foreign legal systems and the adoption of their conventions in the United States. But I think there's just sort of this historical idea about where the regents will come from that would make it pretty easy to slide into, not moving into hereditary monarchy or having Ivanka inherit the presidency so much. But I don't think we would find ourselves shocked if Trump were, put under house arrest, essentially, left to watch television and tweet to people, but that the real work of government started to be done by his closest advisors. The problem, of course, is his closest advisors are not up to the task either, so that's not particularly helpful. But as I was saying this, though, it does occur to me we do have some parallel, some examples of sorts, not direct comparisons, of the same sort of thing happening in the United States. I mean, it would be awfully remarkable if we had made it through 200 plus years of our constitutional history without running into presidents who in fact became incapacitated but weren't deposed from office. We just dealt with it another way. And I mean, there were always rumors, for instance, that, well, let's say between Woodrow Wilson, didn't he have a stroke? And then it was rumored that his wife essentially was handling the day-to-day business of government. And certainly Franklin Roosevelt, who had his own health problems and was occasionally debilitated in one way or another, that Eleanor Roosevelt likewise would step in and handle some of the business. And I guess people used to hint at that possibility. I don't know about when he was still in office, but certainly in his latter days, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan taking care of the business of the retired president anyway. And it's happened in Congress as well, where sitting members of Congress have come to rely on their spouses or top staffers to take care of the day-to-day work and until, just till I can get a handle on things and get better. Because we didn't really know what else to do. Although we have constitutional procedures, the upheaval that could have brought, it was preferred, I think, by the political elite. Look, just so as long as you, Mrs. Roosevelt or Mrs. Wilson, essentially agree to continue on in the policy mode and in the administrative mode of your husband, or by which we mean what we think your husband would do, we will essentially continue to cover this up and not let word out when anybody can do anything about it that the president is incapacitated. They'll just play along with he's fine, he's just not coming out in public. And in those days you could get away with that, I suppose. I don't think that's any longer true. But we do have that kind of parallel in our own tradition. And I guess the bigger point that I would like to have seen developed a little bit more is the idea of watching, doing the closest watching of those closest to him. In the case of FDR and Wilson, I guess the continuity was such that it didn't disturb anybody greatly enough to do something more about it. I'm sure it was whispered about and put the president in a pretty precarious position, but they were, all those objectors were probably reassured by the political elite, political establishment that nothing drastic was going to happen. Here, I mean, with the Trump example, well, you begin with the problem that if you were to govern in continuity with what we already have, you would just be guaranteeing the continuation of the chaos and confusion and upheaval. And nobody wants that. And that's partly because Well, with Wilson and FDR, though surely, Eleanor Roosevelt, I guess, had considerably more, like, political type experience, certainly. At the very least, they were people who cared about the legacy of their husbands and had been around, and dealt with the political culture in a serious way. Their husbands were serious people and serious presidents, and despite the fact that they were physically unable to carry out the work, it was pretty clear that they could express their disapproval of the way things were happening. Donald Trump, doesn't have that. He hasn't had a grip on government ever, has no political experience of his own, so he's got nothing to rely on for his personal judgment. And the people who would take over in his stead, likewise, no political judgment of their own. On top of which, the political elite, or the people who are sitting in the positions previously occupied by an actual political elite for the entirety of our prior history under the Constitution, are themselves either people who have no experience in government or who are crazy themselves. And I guess that's the real point that I really wanted to see some follow-up on, is there's often, in overseas examples, there's often some jockeying for position. There's a lot of power in the offing. And if you can be the one to be named regent or convince the political elite that you ought to be closer to the king or be the one who becomes regent or ought to be put on whatever, the Privy Council, what have you, whatever the mechanism is, there was a lot of maneuvering because there was a lot of power at stake and a lot in play, and you could maneuver to get it for yourself. So likewise, people will do the same in the wake of an incompetent Donald Trump presidency. So it may be a competition between Jared Kushner, maybe even between Jared and Ivanka, for all we know, and Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and others, and Mike Pence, who will feel, that he's got a claim to the title, he being vice president and all. And who knows who else will be jockeying for position in all of this. But on top of which, they're all incomparably evil people and are likely to be just as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than Trump as president himself. There's no relief, in other words, by being able to fall back on close advisors or family to alleviate the situation. It'll only be made worse. And the claim of those family members, depending on who grabs the most power, will also likewise be disputed by other people. Hey, I'm just as crazy and incompetent as that one who's got the veto pen these days. Or why don't you let me rule in Donald Trump's stead? You're nothing special. You got no particular expertise in this. And of course, we just went through the story the other day with Greg about the different factions of the Trump base, and there being at least 5 inside the White House itself. Who knows how much backstabbing there could be behind the scenes in an informal succession situation with Donald Trump. Hope we never get there. But, man, it's given me a lot to think about. All right, how about one more long read-ish item to round out the Friday show and send you into the weekend well-educated, as opposed to the lightning round of many, many items for you to take with you. We'll go in depth on a few more things and give you something else to think about. I want to go back to Qatar. I've never been to Qatar, but I want to go back to the subject of Qatar. And I'll pick up this article here from the New York Times by Max Fisher. I guess this was really something that I had been waiting for, and then we got caught up in a number of other things. I want to put this one on the record for you and give you something to think about when you're contemplating this thing. It's been falling out of the news lately. I don't know whether things are cooling off or we're just ignoring things or what, but I have a feeling this remains relevant, and it's not an awful segue from some of the previous topics of the day. How the Saudi-Qatar rivalry, now combusting, reshaped the Middle East. How is it not such a bad segue? Of course, these are monarchies, hereditary monarchies in the Persian Gulf, and we do well to remember that, and sometimes we lose sight of it because of the modern context that we cram these states into. But we were just going over that not that long ago. So let's head into this piece here and see if we don't learn a thing or two before the weekend comes around. The crisis convulsing the Persian Gulf, entangling the United States, and now threatening to pull in Turkey and Iran can be traced to a dilemma facing a man who had just deposed his own father. You see where we are here? When Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, the Crown Prince of Qatar, took power in a bloodless coup in 1995, he seized a barely independent nation about the size of Connecticut, with 1/7 its population. Now, I happen to know that there's a correction note down at the bottom of the piece here that says, in excusing their mistake, they write a capsule summary on Tuesday for an article about the decades-long rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Qatar omitted the context in describing the population of Qatar. The country's population was 1/7 that of Connecticut's in 1995 when its crown prince seized power. That is not a current comparison. Qatar now has about 2.6 million people and Connecticut about 3.6 million. I think most close observers, though, will point out that a significant portion of the population of Qatar is not actually Qatari people, but rather imported labor that works in many cases in near slave conditions. But that's something we'll address elsewhere. This was just to get the population numbers right. Okay. Anyway, so at that point, it had been dominated since independence in 1971 by its far larger and more powerful neighbor, Saudi Arabia, or as we call it, Saudish Arabia. And I'm sure since 1971 they've been looking and saying, why is that independent over there anyway? He believed Qatar could find security only by transforming itself from Saudi appendage, which it certainly looks like it is, to rival. But how? The audacious plan he put in motion set off something of a regional Cold War, in time remaking not just the politics of the oil-rich Persian Gulf, but also those of the entire Middle East, culminating in last week's crisis. Probably a little further back than that. Now, it would be as if Cuba sought to break from American influence by becoming a global superpower overnight, competing with the United States across Asia and Europe. Qatar's strategy seemed to finally collapse this past week with Saudi Arabia and its allies imposing a blockade. But Qatar has its own allies. The consequences of this rivalry may still be unfolding. In the years before Sheikh Hamad took power, a few incidents deepened his desire to break from Saudi domination. In 1988, his father had established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, a Saudi adversary, giving Qatar a taste of an independent foreign policy. In 1992, a clash with Saudi Arabia along their short but disputed border left 2 Qatari soldiers dead. 2 years later, when Yemen fell into a brief civil war, back then, and back in another one now, Qatar and Saudi Arabia backed opposing sides. Autonomy, Sheikh Hamad learned, could be both feasible and desirable. Mark Lynch, a political scientist at George Washington University, put Sheikh Hamad's view as, why be under the thumb of the Saudis if you don't have to be? The Qatari emir also had ambitions to prove himself more than a Saudi vassal. A lot of it comes down to personality, Mr. Lynch said. When the new emir comes in, he really does have a chip on his shoulder. Few countries have ever grown from client state to regional power. Qatar managed it in just a few years. From the late 1990s on, Qatari foreign policy is a combination of what can we do to get ourselves on the map, and what can we do to annoy the Saudis, Mr. Lynch said. That's not all bad, right? Qatar cultivated ties with Iran, and established trade relations with Israel. But also, for our audience, yes, no. So, okay. We'll leave that there. It became host to a large American air base, in part to guard against Saudi bullying. It established the satellite news channel Al Jazeera, using it to project soft power, we keep hearing about that, promote allies, and needle the Saudi royal family. It also made use of its history as a once remote haven for Islamist exiles. If foreign governments had to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Palestinian group Hamas, Chechen separatists, or even the Taliban, they often went through Qatar. Interesting. Then, in the 1990s, technological and economic developments created a global market for liquefied natural gas, which can be loaded onto ships, bypassing pipelines that would run through Saudi territory. Qatar controls some of the world's largest gas reserves, so its economy expanded from $8.1 billion in 1995 to an astonishing $210 billion in 2014. Sheikh Hamad and his foreign minister jetted from one Arab capital to another, offering their services as mediators and generous donors. The United States found Qatar's diplomacy useful, if sometimes annoying, using it as a base for Afghan peace talks. It relied on its Qatari air base for the war in Iraq and later airstrikes in Syria. In 2002, Saudi Arabia withdrew its ambassador to Qatar, nominally over Al Jazeera's criticism of the Saudi government. It takes until 2008 for Saudi Arabia to really digest the notion that Qatar is a fully independent state, said David B. Roberts, a professor at King's College in London. The Saudi ambassador returned to Qatar in 2008, and the two neighbors might have found equilibrium if not for what came next. The Arab Spring, which saw uprisings across the region in 2011, provided Qatar with an opening. For all its rising influence, Qatar had never been able to crack Saudi regional dominance. Now, with Saudi-aligned autocrats under threat, it saw opportunity. It backed anti-government movements, both secular and Islamist, with Al Jazeera airtime, diplomatic support, and later money and sometimes weapons, hoping to install friendly new governments. When Islamists showed the most promise, Qatar threw its support behind them, which is no different really from Saudi Arabia, and that's not necessarily just in the modern funding of terrorism sense, in which it is true, but also that one thing that keeps me calling it Saudish Arabia rather than just Saudi Arabia. The Saud family managed to take control of the bulk of the Arabian Peninsula and solidify its rule over it versus the previous ruling family by aligning with Islamists, the Wahhabists. It's just in pre-global terrorism days, and when nobody else in the world cared, really, particularly who would ally with who in order to rule the Arabian Peninsula. But very interesting development nonetheless. Wow, lots of shrieking downstairs from the older guy playing his video game. Can you hear that? And I want to introduce you all to my son. He's very excited about his video game. Okay, anyway, back to Qatar. To Saudi Arabia, the uprisings imperiled both the regional order, sure, and potentially its own rule. Populist Islamist movements have long challenged it at home. Every time a vacuum opened, both Gulf rivals would rush to fill it first. From 2011 to 2013, they're in open proxy warfare across the region, Mr. Lynch said. In Tunisia, for instance, each supported opposing political parties. Elsewhere, their rivalry fueled violence. In Libya, each backed armed groups that would later fight a civil war. In Syria, they fought to outbid each other in financing rebels, including extremists. In Egypt, Qatar backed the Muslim Brotherhood, whose candidate won the country's first real presidential vote in 2012. The next year, when the Egyptian military took power in a coup, Saudi Arabia and its allies awarded the new rulers a $12 billion aid package. These interventions, in addition to shaping the Arab Spring, helped realign the region's geopolitics. Turkey, for its own reasons, joined Qatar in backing the uprisings, forming the basis of Qatar's first real alliance. Sunni monarchies like the United Arab Emirates, fearing uprisings at home, consolidated behind Saudi leadership and against Qatar. Their rivalry even extended to Washington, where Qatar spent lavishly on lobbying and think tank donations. The United Arab Emirates did the same, seeking to keep pace with Qatar's influence in the United States. In 2013, you have more or less a rout of the Qatari position, Mr. Lynch said. Qatar's Arab Spring allies suffered devastating setbacks. Sheikh Hamad, in poor health, abdicated the throne and was succeeded by a 33-year-old son with less experience. The country's brief tenure as a regional power ended. Still, Qatar retained the autonomy and network of connections that had been its original goal. Saudi Arabia tolerated Qatar's autonomy to focus on another regional proxy war against Iran. This also served the interests of the United States, which relied on both Saudi Arabia and Qatar in fighting the Islamic State and wanted their rivalry stabilized. The 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran, which Saudi Arabia opposed, further complicated the issue. It left Saudi Arabia more concerned by Qatar's links to Iran, however limited, but less willing to pressure Qatar, which the Saudis knew would inflame tensions with Washington over the Iran deal. The rivals were left in a tenuous, uneasy balance. Though Qatar had stepped back, its campaign taught Saudi Arabia a lesson. An uncontrolled Qatar posed a grave threat. Saudi Arabia, joined by other Gulf states and Egypt, finally found its opportunity to reimpose dominance with last week's blockade. This would also force fence-sitters to choose sides at a moment when Saudi Arabia is stronger. Riyadh is still working to reestablish regional dominance under growing pressure from Iran. But Saudi Arabia appeared to quickly win the greatest prize of all, American backing. President Trump, who received a rapturous welcome in Riyadh last month, welcomed the blockade of an American ally, a stunning policy reversal that seemingly happened overnight. On Twitter, he seemed to imply that the blockade had been his idea. But forcing hands can be risky. Iran has offered food aid to Qatar, betting that it can expand its influence there, and perhaps with two other Gulf states, Kuwait and Oman, that seek a balance between it and Saudi Arabia. Morocco, initially neutral, announced on Monday that it would send food aid to Qatar, according to Moroccan reports. The most significant move could come from Turkey, which has sided vocally with Qatar. Its parliament approved a measure allowing Turkey to deploy up to 3,000 troops to its base in Qatar, where 100 are currently stationed. Aaron Stein, an analyst at the Atlantic Council, a think tank based in Washington, said Turkey had recently patched up relations with Saudi Arabia, seeking a middle ground, but there are limits to that. Turkey's state-dominated media, which has few pro-Saudi voices, has championed the defense of Qatar, an ally, as a nationalist cause. Though Turkey is a NATO member, over the past year it has joined Iran in aligning its regional strategy with Russia's. I wonder how they happen to get away with that. Moscow's position could gain in the crisis as American allies quarrel. Though few expect the standoff to escalate to violence, it remains far from clear how it will be resolved. This may be the end of the 2-decade Saudi-Qatar rivalry, or it could bring just another layer of instability and cross-cutting alliances to a region that already has plenty. Very interesting. I don't know that that's the end of the story by any means. I'm having to take his word for it, but it really sets up all sorts of, well, like he says, cross-cutting alliances, and all the intrigue you could hope for in a great international spy novel. Except it's real life, and lots of people could get killed in it. But don't worry about it. Donald Trump is on the case. Here is some more news, which is likely to surprise absolutely no one. Just thought I would get it on file for you, those of you following. This guy who happens to be the president of the United States, allegedly, Donald Trump. I don't know if you've heard about him. But we have this report in the Atlantic covering the release, I guess about a week ago, of Trump's financial disclosure reports. Donald Trump is reporting he's getting rich as president. That ordinarily doesn't happen. Well, I mean, actually, I guess people report increasing their net worth in office all the time. Not usually the presidency, though, but certainly members of Congress continue to do it for whatever reason. I don't know how often it happens with presidents, but I'm sure it pleases you to no end to find out that he is getting richer as president. The president's submission to the U.S. Office of Government Ethics claims tens of millions of dollars in income from his real estate empire. This is written up by Matt Ford, again for The Atlantic. On June 16th, President Trump says he's received tens of millions of dollars in income from the golf courses and resorts whose profile he boosted during frequent visits since taking office. According to filings released Friday, that would be the previous Friday, by the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. The 98 pages of financial disclosures offer a partial snapshot of Trump's income and assets from January of 2016 to April of this year, as well as indications he's reaped at least a partial windfall since his most recent filing with the Federal Election Commission last year. The filings offer less detailed information about his precise financial situation than would be obtained from his tax returns. Trump broke with modern precedents by refusing to release those returns on the campaign trail or during his presidency. Properties that Trump frequently visited as president saw the largest boost in income. No surprise, of course, that's by design. Trump claimed more than $37 million in income from Mar-a-Lago, the Palm Beach County resort in Florida he described as his, quote, winter White House, as well as $20 million in income from the nearby golf course he owns in Jupiter, Florida. His claimed Mar-a-Lago income rose rapidly since his last two financial disclosures with the FEC. Trump reported more than $15 million in income from the resort in the 2015 report, followed by $29 million in the 2016 version. Golfing and vacationing are bipartisan presidential traditions, as are the partisan critiques of the presidents who partake in them, but Trump has taken his leisure time to new levels, both in volume and location. A May 5th analysis by the Washington Post found that Trump visited at least one of his properties that he owned in 36 of his first 108 days in office, or 1/3 of his presidency to that time. The trips include almost weekly visits to Mar-a-Lago and his Florida properties, where he mingles with guests and club members as well as hosts foreign dignitaries, and of course crashes weddings or whatever might be going on there at the time. Properties that saw fewer or no visits from the president produced no such boost in income from him. His golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, which he only visited for the first time as president in May, brought in $19.7 million in income for him, about the same as his 2016 filing. Other courses throughout the U.S. stayed flat or saw slight declines, while Trump-branded golf courses in Turnberry, Scotland, and Doonbeg, Ireland, reported $14 million and $12 million in income, respectively. The largest single source of income came from Trump National Doral, Miami, a golf resort he purchased in 2012. The president reported $115 million from the resort in his 2017 filing, a hefty sum by any standard, but this year's total represents a multi-million-dollar decline in income after reporting Doral earned him $131 million in income in his filing last year. Complicating any assessment of Trump's financial status is his history of providing mixed signals about incomes and revenues from his property. At the Doral Resort, for example, Trump reported more than $50 million in revenues in 2014 financial disclosure forms, but the New York Times reported he subsequently claimed the resort had actually recorded a net loss of more than $2 million when challenging his local tax bill before local Miami officials. Trump's 2017 filing did contain one unquestionably bright spot of income for the president. In the spring of 2016, when his presidential bid began to break away from his rivals, he reported royalties from his business advice book, The Art of the Deal, amounted to between $50,000 and $100,000. 12 months and one presidential inauguration later, the president reported those royalties now fell within the $100,000 to $1 million range. So, fantastic capitalization on the presidency there. Well done, I guess. Is no surprise to any of us, of course. That was the plan all along. We know that to be the case. All right. Let's see. A few other items of related interest. Let's see. They have this ProPublica piece from a few days ago as well. It's waiting on the computer to bring it up here. Alan Sloan, writing for ProPublica, and of course got published in all sorts of other papers. Dateline the same day, the 16th. Did Trump get a big tax refund after 2005? Donald Trump's supporters crowed when leaked pages of his 2005 return showed he paid a hefty amount of taxes. But the returns for the following years, which remain secret, likely include some hefty refunds on that payment. How do we get to that? This story, as I mentioned, co-published with the Washington Post, as they note up top on it here. The pressure is growing to force President Trump to turn over his tax returns. Is it really? The other day, for example, 200 congressmen filed a suit in federal court arguing that voters and lawmakers have a right to know whether Trump's businesses are violating the Constitution's emolument clause, which bars the president from accepting payments from foreign countries. That led Senate plaintiff, the lead Senate plaintiff in the suit, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, said that the legal effort could force release of the president's tax returns and other business documents during the discovery stage of the litigation. By failing to release his tax returns reflecting payments and benefits from foreign powers, President Trump is thumbing his nose at the American people and the Constitution. Blumenthal told my Washington Post colleague Tom Hamburger he is violating the Constitution by accepting foreign government payments and benefits without consent from Congress, which can't consent to what it doesn't know. But Trump hasn't filed a tax return for 2017, which is the year he became president, and the emolument clause began to apply to him. So even if we got his earlier returns, we wouldn't know what he's done since taking office on January 20th. As for the argument that seeing his returns would expose Russian connections, should they exist, I've written before, his old tax returns, should they ever see the light of day, are unlikely to tell us much about any possible personal financial foreign entanglements. Those might show up if they exist in the filings of the hundreds of companies that make up the Trump empire, but Trump's personal returns are unlikely to show them. We have mentioned that before. But seeing his old returns would tell us something especially relevant about a president who wants to radically reshape our tax code. It would show us how much and in what ways Trump has personally benefited from the legal loopholes scattered throughout the current system, and what impact the changes he's proposing would have on him personally. Trump's tax returns would also let us see, I suspect, that a good part of the tax payments that showed up on Trump's leaked partial 2005 federal return was refunded to him in later years. When the first two pages of that return became public in March, he and his backers took victory laps because the return showed him paying $36.5 million of income tax and having made about $153 million during the year. Among the boasters was Donald Trump Jr., who tweeted about his father's 2005 payments at least 3 times, and at a May campaign rally in Montana told a heckler that his father's 2005 return shows that you can do it all. You can be successful and you can pay your taxes. Gee whiz, I didn't know that was possible. However, for reasons I'll get to in a bit, I think there's a very good chance that Trump got a major portion of his 2005 taxes refunded to him in the 2006 returns and later. If I'm right, it means that a good part of the 2005 payment that Trump and Trump Jr. and other Trump types boasted about amounted to temporary loans to the Treasury, not tax payments as we normally think of them. If so, that would be yet another example of how Trump has gotten a free ride. Okay, in this case, a reduced fare ride on his income taxes. Getting refunds like the one I think Trump got is perfectly legal, but for us to see the 2005 tax payments, but not any subsequent refunds, leaves us with a misleading picture. Should those refunds exist, I think they do, but I can't prove it, they would show up on post-2005 tax returns that we haven't seen and that Trump refuses to disclose. Seeing if he got refunds on his 2005 taxes is yet another good reason for us to want to see Trump's returns, which presidents and presidential candidates have been providing since the days of Richard Nixon. We'd find out about possible refunds of the Trump 2005 taxes by looking at the other credits line on the second page of those returns and seeing if he took any credits on IRS Form 8801. I emailed both Trump's tax attorney and the White House several weeks ago asking them to respond to my theory about Trump having gotten refunds in subsequent years. The law firm to which Trump tax attorney Shari Dillon belongs sent a quick and courteous no comment response. My email to Trump's spokeswoman, Hope Hicks, how does she do it, went unanswered. You know how she doesn't do it, I guess, is the answer. So I'm relying on my own analysis, which is based on information and guidance that I got from about half a dozen tax experts, some of whom I've worked with for decades in the course of writing about taxes. Some of the experts I consulted for this column are tax practitioners. Some are theoreticians. Their political preferences range from pro-Trump to socialist. So, okay, here we go. If you look at Trump's partial 2005 return, which made its way to veteran tax journalist David K. Johnson, with whom I worked at the Detroit Free Press in the 1970s, who gave it to the Rachel Maddow show and put it into the public domain, you see three telling things. First, you see the words client copy on the second page, which raises the possibility that the partial return was sent by someone in Trump's camp with access to Trump documents. Because it puts Trump in a good light, this wouldn't shock me. Second, you see that most of the income tax Trump paid, $31.6 million out of $36.5 million total, arose from what he owed as a result of the alternative minimum tax, a provision of the tax code intended to make sure high-income people pay at least some taxes. Third, you see that Trump used $103.2 million of losses from previous years to reduce his taxable 2005 income. Those losses were lower than his total taxable income. This almost certainly means that he had no losses left to write off because he had more write-offs than had more write-offs been available. Trump could have used them to lower his tax bill. Now, let me try and make sense of all this for you. The only other Trump tax filings that are public, a partial 1995 New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut state returns, show that back then he had an astounding $915 million of losses. You remember this? That he could use in future years to offset income for federal, New York State, and New York City income tax purposes. The 2005 return indicates to me that Trump used up his losses in 2005. He showed $48.6 million of taxable income after subtracting the aforementioned $103.2 million of losses. I'm assuming that from 1996 through 2004, he wiped out his taxable income for federal, New York State, and New York City purposes by using the $915 million in losses, which were generated by the collapse of his real estate casino empire in the 1980s and 1990s, and were probably supplemented with paper losses generated by a special tax code provision that benefits real estate professionals such as Trump. Now, I'll give you a simplified version of why I think, but hasten to say yet again, can't prove that Trump recovered a good part of the $31.6 million of alternative minimum tax that he paid in 2005. The AMT, as it's known, has become a plague to middle income and upper income types who live in states with high income and high real estate taxes. That's despite the fact that when Congress created the AMT in 1969, the goal was to stop a handful of rich people from avoiding income taxes altogether. Over the years, however, Congress failed to modify the AMT sufficiently to keep it from ensnaring millions of middle and upper middle income payers. It turns out there are two separate types of alternative minimum tax. Most people, including me, who pay AMT on top of their regular income tax do so because state and local income taxes and the real estate taxes on our personal residences aren't deductible under the AMT the way they are for regular tax purposes. That leads to the AMT being higher than our regular tax, and the difference between the AMT and regular tax gets added to what we owe Uncle Sam. That kind of AMT payment, arising from what tax techies call an exclusion preference, isn't refundable. But judging from Trump's tax return, it looks like the vast majority of the additional tax he has paid as a result of the AMT arose from so-called deferral preferences, and that most of the $103.2 million of losses he carried over from previous years were deductible for regular income tax purposes in 2005, but not for AMT purposes. Under the tax laws, Trump can get refunds over multiple years up to the refundable portion of the 2005 AMT that he paid. which was probably the vast majority of his AMT. For instance, let's say that Trump had the same income in 2006 that he had in 2005, but didn't have the $103.2 million in losses from previous years. Because the AMT is assessed at a 28% rate and the top regular rate in 2006 was 35%, Trump's regular income tax would probably have been $6.5 million to $7 million higher than his AMT would have been. This would have yielded him a $6.5 million to $7 million refund, with future refunds coming in future years when his regular tax was higher than his AMT. To be sure, part of Trump's 2005 AMT probably comes from not being able to deduct real estate taxes on his personal residences. That exclusion preferences part of his AMT wouldn't be refundable. But the vast majority of Trump's AMT appears to be from deferral preferences, especially since it's unlikely that he paid any significant New York State or New York City income taxes from 1996 through 2004, because the losses he carried over from previous years would have been deductible for New York State and city purposes and would probably have wiped out all or virtually all of his New York income. Given the size of the numbers we're dealing with, his personal real estate taxes and any personal income taxes he might have paid outside of New York are probably rounding errors at most. So, unless Trump started running big losses post-2005, when his losses dating back to the 1990s were all used up, it looks like his regular income tax at a 35% top rate in 2006 and 39.6% in recent years would have excluded his 28% alternative minimum tax. This means that a good part of the AMT that he paid in 2005 would likely have flowed back to him as credits in subsequent years. Hence, my conclusion that although Trump paid $36.5 million in federal income tax in 2005, his ultimate income tax cost for the year was considerably lower. That's the bottom line, or at least I think it is. Of course, there's only one way to find out for sure, and that's to view Trump's post-2005 tax returns if they somehow show up at ProPublica, whose mailing address is 155 Avenue of the Americas, 13th floor, New York, New York, 10013. I'll be more than happy to look at them, even if they prove me wrong. Well, if any of you have it, you know where to go. That would be an exciting prospect. You never know what might turn up over at ProPublica, by God. So, let's keep an eye on things as time marches on. Time now, speaking of time marching on, to hand things over to the guys at the After Show for their Friday installment of the show. Of course, it being Thursday in real life for me, I don't have the preview of what's going to be coming up on the show. I can only tell you that it is its regular fantastic self and will in all likelihood mop up for us on the news we may have missed this morning by pre-recording the show. Oh, one other item that I should include here, since we did get wind of it before taping our show. How about the news that the carrier deal that Trump was bragging on, saving jobs from moving to Mexico? Well, it fell through, and as it turns out, most of the money that carrier was able to use off of its special tax breaks in order to save those jobs did get invested in the plant, but it got invested instead in automation that will make it possible to begin moving those jobs to Mexico after all. What a great deal maker he is. We needed a businessman's good sense in the White House to make those great deals that are great for America. Only he can fix it, right? Man. It never ends with this guy. Of course, there's probably some other outrage that's cropped up in the meantime. Again, stay tuned for the after show to do cleanup work on that front. It's crazy, I'm sure, whatever it is, and we'll catch up with it on Monday when we're back live on the air.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks for listening all the way through another crazy week of the Trump's insane run of the Presidential Apprentice. We'll be back on Monday with more. In the meantime, I do invite you to check out patreon.com, patreon.com/KagroX to be specific. Become a monthly supporter of our show here and let more people learn the ins and outs of what happens in Congress.